Welcome to Windows on the World, and tonight we're going to be talking about cults again. We have covered the cult of the Sabbatean Frankists in quite a few shows. I'm going to give you the links as we go along, but cults are not new. But some cults are bigger than others, and the global cult of Sabbatean Frankism still survives today in the Donmei of Turkey and into the Middle East through Eastern and Western Europe. This cult infiltrated Ireland and England up to Scotland, of course, which had long been infiltrated and was the seat of Kabbalistic Freemasonry through the Scottish Rite. Well, we have covered the great apostasy of false messiahs, Sabbatai Zevi and Jacob Frank in several shows. And in this show, we feature the daughter of Jacob Frank, Rachel Frank, also known as Ava Frank. A fantasy Virgin Mary, an embodiment of the Shekinah. Well, that's according to her father. And if that wasn't enough, Ava even presented herself as a Romanov. A consummate fantasist or flat-out liar, or the divine Shekinah, you're going to have to decide yourself. But this cult can actually be anything they want it to be and do literally anything they want it to do. And the references I'm going to be using tonight, I will put under this show. I'll probably put it all together in an article at windowsontheworld.net, but it will be available also on YouTube and Odyssey. And you can find lots of links and information about the Sabbatean Frankists for the background of all this in Clowns of Kabbalah and the Smart Cabal, which brings us up to date with what is going on in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. And these link to many shows, including the Great Apostasy of 1666, which was when Sabbatai Zevi proclaimed himself to be the Messiah, the new Messiah. So we're going to also be looking at something that's available on researchgate.net, and it's the Mixed Multitude, Jacob Frank and the Frankist Movement, 1755 to 1816. That's just a review, but you can actually get the PDF of the whole book online. Yes, the Mixed Multitude, Jacob Frank and the Frankist Movement, 1755 to 1816 by Pavel Mashieko. Other links are jewishvirtuallibrary.org, Ava Frank, and jewishpress.com features the false messiahship of Ava Frank. I'll put those links in. Well, the story of Jacob Frank, a self-proclaimed reincarnation of Sabbatai Zevi, and of course Sabbatai Zevi was the founder of Sabbateanism, and it shows how self-proclaimed messiahs can capture the minds of the masses. That's what these two actually did at two different time periods. They were both cryptos, basically masquerading under Islam, and later, as in the case of Jacob Frank, Catholicism. His self-proclaimed messianic daughter, Rachel, aka Ava Frank, likewise became a fake converso to Catholicism, and so did at least 20,000 of their followers in a space of a couple of years. But that is the tip of the iceberg, as we are actually dealing with a crypto cult who were outwardly one thing, but inside something completely different, so they didn't have to disclose what they were to any outsider whatsoever. Sabbatean founder Sabbatai Zevi had been given a choice after being banned from Smyrna by the Sultan: either convert to Islam or be executed. So he converted to Islam, and he later became the doorman to the Sultan, and he lived pretty well. Sabbatai Zevi died in 1676, aged 50, and he's buried in Montenegro. So see our articles linked to Clowns of Kabbalah on the homepage Windows on the World. Just put it into the search bar at the top, it all comes up. Let's get on to Jacob Frank. Jacob Frank was born around 1726 in Podolia, which is in today's Ukraine. Frank grew up in the Sabbatean religious community and later incorporated his teaching and its teachings into his own belief system. So basically, he used this as a backdrop and created his own version, which was called Frankism. So the two different movements are called Sabbatean Frankism. And of course, Jacob Frank stated he was the reincarnation of Sabbatai Zevi and actually King David as well. We'll get into that later. But basically, it was inspired by Kabbalah and Catholic Marian mysticism, which brings us into the 1800s, and the show we did, The Irish Count. They warned you. It's called They Warned You, The Irish Count. Well, Jacob Frank was to proclaim his daughter an incarnation of the Virgin Mary, which is incredible chutzpah when you think about it. We covered the infiltration of Catholicism in that show, so do have a look at it. But the Catholic Church had many Frankist priests. The past Frankist name, for instance, Krajewski, still comes up in the Vatican hierarchy. I actually looked up the ancestry of Krajewski, and yes, they were infiltrators of the Vatican and still are. So the people who were the offspring and the relatives of the Sabbateans, many of them are still practicing as Sabbateans. So we don't know who they are or, in fact, what they're doing. So see Cabal, Cabala Conmen, and the Smart Cabal for updates on the infiltration by the Don May, the Freemasonic brethren of the Sabbatean Frankists from Turkey into the Saudi Arabia of today. And we have to remember that the Don May were responsible for the Young Turks uprising in what is now modern-day Turkey. So they were a very powerful group. Do not underestimate this group. They are still very powerful in Saudi Arabia today. Do look at that article, The Smart Cabal. So the leader of one of the branches of the Turkish Sabbateans was also Baruch Rousseau, who lived 1695 to 1740, known as Senor Santo. And he had been considered yet another incarnation of the Messiah. So none of this is new. There was people actually just before Jacob Frank, this guy Baruch Rousseau, he actually stated that he was the Messiah also. So the final incarnation of the Messiah was thought to be Jacob Frank, or as he called himself, the Holy Father. And you can read more about Jacob Frank if you look up Gershon Scholem's work on the Sabbatean Frankists. So after his death in 1791, the role of the Messiah was taken over from Jacob by his daughter Ava Frank, who lived 1754 to 1816. And we're going to refer now to the Prague texts. And they referred to Ava Frank, or Rachel Frank as she was previously known, as Gevira or the Virgin. And I'm going to quote from a source here, which you can find if you look it up on the internet. She is the Messiah who did not come to mind. No one thought of it, but it is this Virgin who is Gevira, who will bring redemption. When the partition of Poland led to her father's release, because Jacob Frank was actually imprisoned in Poland when the Polish authorities found out what he was up to, Ava had accompanied him on his travels and played a key part in the movement. She was also with him when he was in prison. He ordered it. So he was extremely controlling. And it is Ava's role as the incarnation of both the Virgin Mary and the Shekinah that we shall be elucidating on in this show, along with her father's controlling of both his wife and daughter into his messianic fantasy cult. So we're going to get into what are known as the Prague texts, which are considered a great source of theological concepts of the last stage of this Frankist movement. And their main author was Low Enoch von Honningsberg, who lived 1780 to 1828. He was a Jewish Haskalah thinker and preacher. In his work, it can be seen that he welcomes the political limitations on religious powers and the resistance against long privileged social classes of his time. So here we see the revolutionary spirit of the Freemasons in the work of Low Enoch von Honningsberg. And he rejoices over the demise of the old empires which began to crumble under the weight of the French Revolution and following the Napoleonic Wars. So we're really looking at the precursor to today's global governance. And the preacher assures his listeners that there is no need to fear the revolution, as it is a sign of the times that encourages hope for the imminent arrival of the Messiah. And the revolutionary spirit is of course taken into account and then harnessed and steered. So, in the Frankist community in Offenbach, Germany, the Frankists tried to embody the cosmic story of Kabbalah, the idea of reunification of male and female, with the divine Shekinah, of course. This 16th century Frankist community was based in a Renaissance chateau, which still stands today in the town of Offenbach, in the state of Hesse, on the left bank of the River Main in Germany. It became the base of Frank's spiritual movement for almost 30 years. Behind its walls, his believers could carry on, of course, without persecution. When Frank established his what he called his official court in Offenbach, Germany in 1787, he perpetuated this mystique of his daughter Ava, who was born Rachel, as the reincarnation of the Virgin Mary and the divine Shekinah, the female essence of divinity, and she became venerated in her own right by his followers. Well, according to Frank, Frank bolstered Ava's exclusive standing in his movement by circulating the story that she was an illegitimate child of the Russian Empress Katharina and was therefore a princess in the house of Romanov, despite her real mother being a Cohen. Well, just before 1800, the movement began sending out letters. They were so-called red letters. They were written in ink by a cabal of Frankists from nearby administrative centres, and they were all sent by these Frankist communities who were scattered throughout Central and Eastern Europe at the time. This was just before 1800, the late 1700s. They helped write letters in red ink that the Częstochowans, well, Częstochowa is a city in southern Poland on the Water River. These people who lived in Szczecin, the red letters were sent to all places where Jews may have gathered. So they were trying to convert all the Jews into this new Frankist movement. Letters had to be submitted at the post offices in Frankfurt, Hanau and other nearby places, and these many letters were sent under numerous aliases, of course many from the same person. So they perpetuated this flood of letters through these groups of Frankists. So the letters from the Szczecinians called upon European Jews to convert to Christianity, and they warned of impending disaster, a forthcoming apocalypse. The community was nicknamed Eisenberg Castle, or the Polish Court, and sometimes also known as the Holy Camp. Well, the Holy Camp referred to the biblical camp of Jews travelling through the desert. Well, don't let reality ever get in the way of a good cover story based on fantasy. And this should have been the motto of both Sabbatai Zevi and Jacob Frank. Well, in this chateau, there was a darkened, holy room where the clothes of the late Jacob Frank were stored. Here, pilgrims would pray and prostrate themselves, and one observer reported, Jacob Frank, who died some time ago, was considered a god. They have a certain room with a bed, a red velvet cover and some trousers. Whoever enters the room must fall on the ground and worship Jacob Frank. All the Pragas, as they were known, who stayed in Offenbach did just this. The room was also constantly filled with incense. This is very similar to the story perpetuated by the Rosicrucians, and here we see the Kabbalistic crossover, this fake mystery that the Kabbalists had used to bring together people under this messianic cult. So because of the red letters, adherents of Frank's teachings came from all over Europe, and they brought valuable gifts from which the Offenbach community financed its activities. It had very, very strong financial support. And the castle also served as a place of pilgrimage. They appear to have been very well funded. Well, after the death of Jacob Frank in 1791, his daughter Ava became the prominent personality of what was then known as the House of God. In Frank's imagination, the androgynous concept of God from the book of Zohar gave rise to a vision of the future, a perfect couple of Adam and Eve who would defeat the other side. Of course, Ava was going to be Eve, and Frank personified himself as Adam. The Zohar being another fantasy work, of course, by another fantasist, Moses de Leon, in the 13th century, who was also known as Simeon ben Yochai. Well, Jacob Frank had a vision of himself and his daughter correcting the sins of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis and bringing full divinity into the world. The Prague Frankists, or fantasists, perceived Ava Frank as the Virgin of God and the divine Shekinah, an idea that is a synthesis of Marianology and the Zoharic mysticism, or just plain BS. So Rachel, aka Ava Frank, was the daughter of Jacob Frank, and she lived 1726, so he lived 1726 to 1791, to recap, and her mother was Hannah Cohen, Cohen with a K, and Hannah was born in 1754. So, sorry, not Hannah was born in 1754, Ava was born in 1754. Okay, just doing a bit of a recap for you here because there's a load of information. And Ava was born in Nikopol in Bulgaria, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire, into the Jewish Muslim community of the Donmei. So the Donmei were also in Bulgaria. She followed after Frank, who had also proclaimed himself Messiah, following the previous self-proclaimed Messiah Sabbatai Zevi. Well, Jacob Frank had also stated that he was the reincarnation of King David. Fantasy and egomania will facilitate anything, and there are always plenty of willing dupes to believe such claims. So the fakery and fantasy of Frankism infiltrated through Islam and later into Catholicism. So I'm going to have a short break now. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. Just a few things to remind you of, that we are changing our platform. We will be going to Podbean at the end of the year or before the end of the year. And I would encourage people to download the whole back catalogue of shows. And the thing about the Windows on the World shows as they have progressed over the years is that they are great reference material. I actually use them myself for that very reason. There is stuff that I need to recount, and also to use, because I actually use it myself as an archive. So you can do that too. And what's great, I think, about the shows and the whole purpose of them is that they can spur you on to other research. So we're putting out a bigger picture here. We're joining a lot of dots up in a historical way, which goes into the present when it's so important. And that's the whole purpose, again, of the shows. So what I want to do is have this lifelong learning project, and I will carry on doing it. And what these shows are, they are a way into information. There's a lot of information in the shows. You can listen to them many times and still pick things out. And a lot of people do just that. So I would actually encourage you to download them, because we don't know where the internet's going. We've been completely marginalized off the internet. The algorithm doesn't allow what we do. And we are still really liked by our audience, because that's what's the great thing about it, because the emails I get, and if I put one of the shows up on YouTube, I don't put all of them on YouTube, so do go to the archive at windowsontheworld.net, the Sunday show archive, which is on the live shows page, and just go through the site and look at those articles, because you'll find so much information. I can't keep up with it myself, so I don't expect you to. And the main thing is that it keeps going. So I also wanted to thank everyone who supports us. And of course, we have changed the banking details. I had to get rid of this bank. It was so incompetent. So if you were supporting us through the bank and you have not yet done so, please email me, info@windowsontheworld.net, and I will send you the new bank details. You can, of course, support the show on the homepage too. We do use PayPal and Patreon, but it's better just to pay straight. And we have a thing called the £5 a month club, which helps to cover some of the expenses. So I do appreciate the people who appreciate the show. So let's now get on with this amazing part of history. So let's get back into what we were talking about, and the Age of Enlightenment, which had absorbed Kabbalistic doctrine into Christianity. That's what we're talking about here. There's a really good book you can get about this, and it's called The Kabbalah, Its Influence on Judaism and Christianity by Bernard Pick. We have covered that in previous shows. I would recommend you get it. It's republished by Kessinger Publications. You can find a PDF of it on the internet. I'm pretty sure I did, but I've actually got the physical book as well. So this Kabbalistic fantasy world had attracted Freemasons and Rosicrucians and such occultists as MacGregor Mathers with his book Kabbalah Unveiled, and it was also influencing the Golden Dawn. So the cult of Frankism, as we said before the break, had attracted a huge amount of followers throughout Eastern Europe, and over several decades, as we've said, at least 26,000, but probably masses more Frankists were baptized in Poland. There were most probably many, many more, as obviously this was a crypto cult. The rabbinical authorities in Poland excommunicated Jacob Frank and his followers due to his heretical doctrines that had rejected all the prohibitions and restrictions of Jewish law. They basically did what they want. This included incest and self-deification. These are the things which the rabbis really disliked Jacob Frank for: the incest and his self-deification, his ridiculous claims of being the new King David. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous, but it goes along with the fantasy world of Sabbatai Zevi. So they were both fantasists, they were both narcissists, they were both egomaniacs. And people do follow these kind of characters. We see it today. We have internet ones today, don't we? We have fake gurus. We have all these fake gurus like Sadhguru and all these people who came in through the New Age and the UN cult. It's all pretty much the same thing, actually. It's all a huge deception. So the rabbinical authorities in Poland excommunicated Jacob Frank and his followers due to his heretical doctrine. And of course, the Frankists believed in incest, wife-swapping, orgies, and redemption through sin. This was exactly what Sabbatai Zevi had been thrown out of Smyrna for. And we have his story in the archive, but there's so much about the Frankists you can get from good sources. It's really worth doing some digging around on the internet too. But what I've done is I've condensed these things so that you get a good potted history with the links and how they link to other things. That's the important things, the influence that these people had and still have today. So Frank's followers started converting to Catholicism around 1759, and he was imprisoned in Poland in 1760, but freed after the partitioning of Poland by Russia in 1772. And he moved to Habsburg, to the Habsburg Empire, and as we said in the first part of the show, he stayed in Offenbach in this castle. Among the Prague Frankists who visited the court in Offenbach were often financial people with lots of money. Solomon Zerkovitz, Jonas Weil and his sons Abraham Jontef and Ekiba, and son-in-law Lo Enoch von Honingsberg, who we've already mentioned, Aaron Beer Weil and his daughter Amelia, and nieces Louisa Clarenberg and Gabriel Porges, and his sons Moses and Leopold. These were all very influential and rich people. So thanks to reports from a large number of visitors, testimonies and information about what happened behind the walls of Issenberg Castle have been very well preserved. There is a conspiracy of silence among this cult, which is what, of course, makes it dangerous. Some sources state that there was military discipline in the castle and that the residents were subject to a strict hierarchy. There are many links you can get to this, and they are in the links that I gave before the show, but they will take you to other links. And that particular quote was from Mouthner in 1918. But military training took place in the courtyard of the castle. So this was not only an obsessive cult, but it was a cult that was ready for war also. Over time, the community gained power and resources sufficient to maintain its independence and its armed forces. They had so many weapons that it was necessary to hide them when the French troops arrived in Offenbach during the War of the Second Coalition, which was in 1798 to 1802. Well, in time, Jacob Frank succeeded in realising a plan formed in 1759 to acquire land on which a battle-ready settlement could be established. So this was not only an apocalyptic cult, a fake cult based on lies, but it was also a warring military faction of people. Well, in time, Jacob Frank succeeded in realising this plan, and the designation of the Frankist court as the holy camp of the Israelites, get this, the holy camp of the Israelites in Offenbach, Germany, did not remain a mere self-denomination and a spiritual aspiration. By their actions, the inhabitants of Eisenberg Castle also emulated the military character of the original community in Israel. According to the Tanakh, the Israelites made their way through enemy troops after leaving Egypt, of course. They conquered the territory promised by the Lord thanks to their military organisation. So in his fantasy world, this is what Jacob Frank was ready for. It can be presumed that the Offenbach community prepared for this final apocalyptic military clash between the forces of good and evil, which of course depends on where you're looking at it from and what you think is good and what you think is evil. This is the upside down, topsy-turvy, inverted world of the Frankists, remember. It can be presumed that the Offenbach community prepared for the final apocalyptic military clash there in the castle, and this theme can be observed in spiritual movements inspired by a specific interpretation of the Hebrew Bible throughout history. So basically, all of this fantasy was based on past stories, and that's what this is all about. It's about taking history, manipulating it to your own ends, and that's what these narcissistic egomaniacs Sabbatai Zevi and Jacob Frank were all about. Well, if we can go back to the Essenes, a community inhabiting a fortress in Qumran north of the Dead Sea, they were a very pure sect, however. They were nothing like these people, the Frankists, but they had a kind of willingness to go to war. They were not actually a passive community as many people think they were. Just an interesting aside there, and something that was brought up in some of the history that I've just been looking through. So their vision of the end of the world consisted of a final war they would wage by the side of God and thus save the world from the clutches of evil. In other words, they would be in power. It is also possible to identify a combination of Jewish religious ideas and efforts to create military force in two Renaissance leaders operating in southern Europe and also claiming to be messiahs. One was Shlomo Moltke, who lived in 1500, he died in 1532, and David Rubini, 1490 to 1535, and he negotiated, David Rubini, with Emperor Charles V to create a Jewish army to help the Christians fight the Ottoman Empire and regain the Holy Land. Well, nothing's really changed here when you think about it. Look at the allies of today and the people who set up Israel. So we're still going along with this same version of history. Jacob Frank had similar ambitions when he offered Emperor Joseph II military aid against the Turks in 1786. So we're not sort of talking here about some farcical cult or some decadent, orgy-loving, wife-swapping swingers. These people were highly organised and very militaristic. So, according to one of the witnesses, military discipline linked to esoteric knowledge was a part of religious life in the Offenbach community. One of them said, "In the castle where no unauthorised person dares to enter, mystagogical customs remain and prevail. The newcomers are acquainted with Kabbalistic and alchemical secrets." So we can see here the influence into the Rosicrucians, into the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. So when we're talking about infiltration, it's actually on a very big scale here. And the faith blends with military obedience. This faith blended with military obedience. And that's according to the writer Mauthner in 1918. So this reference to alchemy by Fritz Mauthner, who was a philosopher, he was actually of Frankist descent, may be elucidated by a statement by Peter Beer, 1758 to 1838, who was a Jewish educator and researcher, and he wrote hundreds of combat documents. He wrote of hundreds of these trainees who were in this castle, who also attended lectures on chemistry and even carried out chemical experiments. So this was a very serious cult. And there are similarities here, actually, with Jonestown, Jim Jones. Just as the well-known American movement, the People's Temple of the Disciples of Christ, also prevented its members from leaving Jonestown in the 1970s, the Frankists in Offenbach also guarded the borders of the community. You weren't allowed out. And some well-connected Frankists, including Moses Porges von Portheim and his brother Leopold Porges von Portheim, and their friend Johann Hofsinger, were actually able to flee. They managed to escape in the middle of the night. The violent regime at the Offenbach court is also demonstrated by a report about community members being beaten and imprisoned in the castle dungeon for disobedience. Unlike all con men of Kabbalah, Jacob Frank adapted his cult for different audiences. A consummate con man or a messianic figure, take your pick. I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? One man's con man is another man's messiah. And we still have that same problem today. And probably worse, because they can be created on the internet. We don't even have to write hundreds and thousands of letters to people these days. It was, in religious terms, a heretical cult built around the redemption through sin and a reversal of conventional morals. And Frank's claims, like that of Sabbatai Zevi, could be described as outrageous or just plain ridiculous. Well, Jacob Frank died in 1791. Most importantly, it was his daughter Rachel, also known as Ava, who took over as the new self-proclaimed Messiah. She presented herself as an incarnation of the Virgin Mary, which had been instigated, of course, under Jacob's influence. The cult actually practiced a reversal of Christian doctrines. And Jacob Frank's autobiographical writings, preserved in Frankist circles, included a Polish text entitled The Sayings of the Master. No modesty on show here. This document set forth a mythical new reality in which Frank portrayed himself as a messianic figure related to the biblical patriarch Jacob and associated with the Kabbalistic entity of the divine male, the Tiferet, in the Kabbalah, divine glory. So Ava really didn't have any choice. She had to get up there with him or even try and top what he was doing. In this formulation, Jacob Frank's consort is portrayed as the biblical matriarch Rachel. Well, what was his daughter called originally? Rachel, and is also associated with the mystical entity of the divine female Shekinah. Well, Frank's wife Hannah, who was forced by her husband to play the public role of his mystical partner, the Matronita, she called herself the Matronita under his power, died very, very unhappy at the beginning of 1770 when their daughter Ava was 16 years old. Well, Frank did not allow his daughter to leave him or to marry. He was very controlling, and we have to actually put forward that this probably was an incestuous relationship with his daughter. Everything that you read indicates this. A prohibition was enforced on all his followers, and they constituted a messianic community based on a communal sexual life with no restrictions or respect for marriage vows. So basically, it was like a swinger's paradise. The previous incarnation, Sabbatai Zevi and his followers, were known as the wife-swapping Jews of Salonika, by the way. Well, Jacob Frank also demanded that Eva remain with him in prison when he was incarcerated between 1760 and 1772. So this is extremely creepy when you look at the detail. So Frank died in 1791. Ava played the roles of Rachel, the beloved of Jacob, and the Shekinah Matronita, the spouse of him as Tiferet, Yaakov. And her father referred to his daughter with a citation from the Zohar, describing the agonized Shekinah who responds to her lover as a beautiful maiden who has no eyes. That is from the Zohar, and you can find that in one of the chapters, the Mishtapin. Jacob Frank saw himself as the eternal Messiah and told his followers that Ava or Rachel should be recognized as the mystical royal figure of the Shekinah who would lead them as a messianic redeemer while he was temporarily absent, or, in other words, dead. Well, ultimately, Frank claimed he would be reborn and united with his daughter in the unity of Messiah and Shekinah. In the last decade of his life, Frank had lived in Brunn, then Austria, and in Offenbach in Germany, as we've already been through, with his daughter, and he discussed Ava's messianic nature in these inner Frankist circles. So he was already paving the way for Ava to become this Messiah, this new Virgin Mary, this embodiment of the Shekinah. And so in the Frankist circles, he was spreading this rumour also that Ava was an illegitimate child of the Russian Empress Catherine of the House of Romanov. Lie after lie after lie. Nothing was sacred in this cult. In 1777, Jacob Frank had taken Eva to Vienna, where both were received at the royal palace. And this was because of this lie that Ava was a descendant of the Romanovs, when of course she wasn't. Her mother was a Cohen. In that year, he'd had portraits of his daughters sent to Frankist communities in Hamburg and Altona, together with pronouncements of her messianic nature. So she was royalty, she was the embodiment of the Virgin Mary, she was the Shekinah, and she was divinity in persona. So, after Jacob Frank's death in 1791, which of course he had described as a temporary absence, Ava led the Frankist court in Offenbach with her two younger brothers. And in 1800, Ava sent letters to hundreds of Jewish communities encouraging conversion to Christianity, as a cover story of course, and enlistment in the Frankist movement. Her request for financial help was supported by these quotations from her father's teachings and promises of approaching messianic redemption. Well, there's no grifter like a Frankist grifter. In 1803, the Offenbach court dismantled and the Frankists returned to Poland, where Ava conducted herself as a Romanov princess and lived as the Sabbatean Frankist leader until her death in 1816. So she was masquerading as a Romanov. I mean, when you think about what actually happened to the Romanovs, this is not just an insult to history. It's beyond what anybody would even think one should be capable of pulling off. But chutzpah is everything, of course. So not only was her life a fantasy, it was also a complete fabrication or flat out lie. Well, so her father had spread this rumour that Ava, who actually called herself Ava Romanovna at that point, was an illegitimate child of Catherine II of Russia. So not only was this a fantasy, it was just a blatant and flat out lie. The barefaced chutzpah of these fraudsters did, however, seem to work, and their infiltration through Catholicism worked well for them amongst their followers. So, in fantasy world, or simulated reality, Ava was referred to in Frankist writings as the Lady, the Virgin, also the Matronita, which was the Aramaic name of the mystical female entity Shekinah. And to recap, she had become known as Ava following the conversion of her family to Christianity. This conversion had protected the Sabbatean group, which was being persecuted now by Jewish communities in Galicia and Podolia for heretical views and the unacceptable sexual behaviour of the cult. And it had enabled the members to preserve their secret rituals based on messianism and anarchy in all aspects of their lives. They were disliked wherever they went, so wherever they ended up did not matter. A secret cult to outsiders and in effect a completely secret society. We've covered how this cult infiltrated the Irish priesthood under crypto-Irish names, and the Mary cult in Ireland is timed directly to the influence of the Frankists and Ava Frank, and really gaining pace in the late 1800s. Well, Jacob Frank's autographical writings and his Polish text entitled The Sayings of the Master set forth this new reality in which Frank had portrayed himself as this messianic figure. So he had the writings to back it all up, related to the biblical patriarch Jacob and associated, of course, with the Kabbalistic entity of the divine male Tiferet. This was just as ridiculous a claim as any made by himself and the earlier Kabbalists. Well, we can give examples here as Moses de Leon, also known as Simeon ben Yochai, and his claims that his mystical writing, the Zohar, was actually from 800 years before he compiled it. And if you want to know more about that and about Kabbalism, the best book on the subject is by Gershon Scholem. And then you can go from there because he gives you the names, the people and the dates. Getting back to this, Jacob Frank also demanded that Ava remain with him in prison. Remember that, he was incarcerated between 1760 and 1772 to recap. But up until his death in 1791, Ava had played the roles of Rachel, the beloved of Jacob, the Shekinah Matronita, the spouse of Tiferet Yaakov, meaning she was the embodiment of the female divinity and he was the glorious and beautiful one. Well, modesty and reality had gone out of the window, and if they were ever there in the first place, they were never to return, of course. So her father referred to his daughter with a citation from the Zohar. And yes, just to recap, the agonized Shekinah who responds to her lover as a beautiful maiden who has no eyes. This stuff is beyond creepy, isn't it? It's absolutely beyond creepy, and you don't really have to, as I said, read between the lines. So, ultimately, Frank claimed he would be reborn and united with his daughter in the unity of Messiah and Shekinah. And in the last decade of his life, Frank had lived, as we've said, in Austria and then often back in Germany. So, it was in 1777 Frank took Ava to Vienna, where both were received at the royal palace, and he had these portraits of his daughters sent to Frankist communities in Hamburg, conning them into thinking that she was a real princess, a Romanov. So, in 1800, Ava then sent letters to these hundreds, probably thousands of Jewish communities encouraging conversion to Christianity and enlistment in this Frankist movement, and they were known as the Red Letters. And her request for financial help was supported by her father's writings. And in 1803, the Offenbach court dismantled and the Frankists returned to Poland, and Ava had conducted herself as a Romanov princess. So after Jacob Frank's death in 1791, Ava became known as the Holy Mistress and assumed leadership of the Frankists and became the only woman in history to be declared a Jewish Messiah, or should we say a false Jewish Messiah, or false Catholic Messiah, or false impersonator of the Romanovs. It is in this capacity that she wrote this in October 20th, 1792, and its correspondence to Frankfurt merchant Jean Hartmann Lindheimer, who was later to be very unhappy about the amount of money that she owed him. Here's what she said. I did not want to inconvenience you again, but need obliges me, because I do not have enough sugar to share amongst the poor people. So I have waited a while with the exchange until I have asked you to be kind enough to send me a single centner of sugar again. I think she's talking about money here. In case you have fine white sugar, I would prefer that. I hope you won't refuse me. Also, if you have 5 centnars of rice, or 5 centnars of millet, or 10 centnars of barley, whichever of these 3 types you have, and could let me have one of them, it would make me enormously happy. The exchange will follow quickly, as I soon have to reply through my servants. I will be very grateful to you for the news you will be able to bring me soon. I have pleasure to thank you. So Lindheimer, the benefactor, who lived 1753 to 1824, was a prosperous merchant in the Sachsenhausen section of Frankfurt. He was a relative of Goethe, whose material grandmother was also a Lindheimer, very well connected. So Ava, having sent the red letters to hundreds of the Jewish communities, had her financial requests fulfilled, and they were supported by quotations from her father's writings, of course, and it was all based on his BS. So an almighty con was being played out. Whilst masquerading as a Romanov, Ava, also known as Rachel, of course, had gone all the way in her royal impersonation. She even had cutlery engraved with E.R., Ava Romanovna, and also signed her letters as E.R. However, fate eventually caught up with her and her life of fantasy or lies, and she became a prisoner of her own creation. She ran up debts of 800,000 guilders and was placed under house arrest until she died on the 17th of September 1816. As her letter shows, her funds eventually ran out and she found herself deep in debt with local merchants, including, of course, Lindheimer, who finally took legal action against her. She died in poverty, however, before the matter or any of the money came back to the creditors. As there is no moral to this story, there has to, I think, be a lesson. If you're going to hoodwink people on a huge scale, make sure you have very, very generous backers who do not charge interest and force repayment. And this ends the story of the Virgin Mary Shekinah. In the Offenbach parish record, however, she was recorded as Ava Frank Romanovna. Ava Frank, the potless royal impersonator, the fake Catholic, fake virgin, fake Messiah, who died in poverty, but as far as we know, kept up her ridiculous facade until the very end. Well, as all of us know, lies do indeed live on, and as there are still Sabbatean Frankists amongst us today, we should be aware of infiltration from all corners, from all sides, and that goes into the present, when the current infiltration and the takeover of groups is on a mass and industrial scale. I hope you enjoyed that. That was just an insight into the strange world of Jacob and Ava Frank, and it's something that doesn't get talked about very much. So, until the next show, Do stay in touch through the website. That's it from Windows on the World.